So, can everyone hear me? Great, great. Robin was on the search committee back in 2012 when I interviewed here at Northwestern. So it's great to like kind of come full circle. Yes, as Robin indicated, I'm 50-50. I'm 50% in the psychology department, 50% in the Feinberg School of Medicine in the Medical Social Sciences department. And I'd also like to acknowledge the contributions of Eileen Graham, who's listening in today. She's a research assistant professor in medical social sciences and a very close colleague of mine who hopefully soon will be promoted to research associate professor in medical social sciences. And just want to acknowledge her contributions because she was been my like close collaborator, on this work. Whoops, that thing again like I did before. There we go. This should be great. Perfect. Okay, so quick overview. Talk a little bit about dementia and dementia prevention, just very briefly, and then transition to what Robin was just talking about, this interesting phenomenon of toleration of neuropathology, which has been termed cognitive resilience. And then I'll talk about the role of personality in cognitive resilience. That would be the data that I'll present today, which actually just got published last year. And then talk about some future directions and an R01 application that unfortunately didn't do so well in the first round of review, but hopefully, like next time, or maybe the next time after that, maybe we'll get this funded. This is an R01 that's focused on cognitive resilience, and it involves several IPR associates or faculty affiliates, who I'll mention later. And talk about a little bit about the concept of coordinated analysis, because we hope to in this R01 enhance the robustness and replicability of these findings with a coordinated analysis. So talk a little bit about that. Oh, yes. Sure. Oh, you know what? You know what happened? It got detached. So let me just reattach. Is that better? Better, even better. Okay. And then finally, since this is the IPR, I will discuss some policy implications at the very end. Okay, so just a couple slides on just dementia in general. It's fairly prevalent. There's about 6.2 million Americans age 65 and older who are living with Alzheimer's or other types of dementia, vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, et cetera. In 2021. By 2050, this is expected to rise to about 13 million. Dementia is also, and again, there's a policy implication right here at the very beginning. Dementia is very costly. In a very influential New England Journal of Medicine paper, but done by an economist. Oh, I should say, if you want, you can. I'll take clarifying questions like throughout, and then we'll do regular questions and answers at the end. The economist Michael Hurd, in a pretty influential New England Journal of Medicine article back in 2013, estimated the cost of dementia to be at that time between 157 and 250 billion dollars, and it concluded that that's roughly the same as the financial burden of heart disease and cancer, and there's the reference to it right there. Extrapolating the Hurd estimates, the Alzheimer's Association has indicated that in 2021, it'll probably be 355 billion. And by 2050, these costs could rise as high as over $1 trillion. There's some reason to believe like it might not quite be that much, but nonetheless, it's nonetheless very costly. So there are some very strong policy implications just right off the bat to dementia. Even worse, there's no good treatments. There have been over 200 clinical trials for various, dementia drugs, and pretty much all of them have failed. There's just a couple of them that are out there, Aricept and one other, and they're not very good. There's a new one that just got approved, but it's like there's a lot of controversy, and all these people resigned from the FDA panel, because they said that it really shouldn't have been approved. So there's basically not really good medications. So what this has done, so I've portrayed this very pessimistic picture. I'll get optimistic now at this point. What this has done is it has prompted a shift towards prevention, more of a prevention focus. Well, maybe, there is there's hope. There's some new tau clearing drugs they're in development stage. It's still possible that there still could be some medications that that could be developed in the years to come. But for now, there's this shift in thinking that, well, maybe we should think about lifestyle factors and other things that might prevent dementia in the first place, or at least delay its onset, to like much later in the lifespan. One key to understanding prevention is to understand this concept that Robin had just mentioned, this toleration of neuropathology or cognitive resilience. Now, what is this? Many older adults don't present signs of clinical dementia while alive, but nonetheless reveal high levels of brain pathology, dementia-related pathology, upon autopsy. So these cognitively healthy older adults, again, upon autopsy, are found to harbor significant dementia-related pathology, amyloid, tau, TDP-48, in their brains, but in life they were fine. So this discordance, this minimal cognitive decline, despite significant brain pathology, it's not unusual. Some studies place it between 30 and 50%. Most studies are between about 36% and 43%. So roughly, you take the midpoint of that, it's about like 2 in 5 older adults at the point of death have all this dementia-related pathology in their brains, but they were fine, or at least they had just the regular expected normal cognitive decline, the normal memory decline, speed of processing decline that you would just see in anyone who would make it into their 80s or even their 90s, not something that would be considered the clinical syndrome of dementia. Oh yes, yeah. You mean like it seems to be leveling, and so that's why I said earlier about this. $1 trillion, might not be so bad. There's a couple of factors that are complicating things about, like, whenever you project into the future. There's two things. There's one big thing. There's big cohort differences in education. So I'm going to talk about this. Thank you. The next slides are going to talk about education. As each cohort gets older, there's the levels of education are better. If you go back to if people born in like the 1920s and stuff, they have if they were lucky to have like an 8th grade education, but like anyone born 1960s or later, it's like has much. So education is a very good predictor of dementia level and of cognitive resilience. And so, it might not be so bad. Maybe there won't be 13 million people in 2050 who have, because there's going to be more people who are more educated. That's one. That's probably the biggest factor. There was also talk about statins and the high prevalence of statins, and that actually there seems to be some evidence that statin drugs might also have some preventative effect, especially on vascular dementia, but also perhaps on Alzheimer's. So the fact that all of us are on statin. Well, speak for myself, but like a lot of us are on statins, and are on statins from like age 30s to, that actually might also reduce the prevalence. So yeah, so that would so stay tuned. Really interesting stuff. Great question. Conversely, there are some individuals with the reverse, significant cognitive decline despite minimum neuropathologic burden. That's a much smaller group. So you have the two regular groups, like, oh yeah, lots of neuropathology in your brain, and you had dementia. Okay, great. Well, that makes sense. Oh, there's not so much, and you didn't have dementia. Okay, that makes sense too. Then you have this resilient group, which is a pretty big group, maybe 2 in 5, and then you have a much smaller group that's like, well, you had dementia, but you really didn't have any, that's a much smaller group. So what's interesting is that this cognitive resilience group may hold the key to understanding prevention of dementia. What is it about these people that make them tolerate this neuropathology that allows them to live with the disease or live with the pathology? Just to define cognitive resilience, it can be defined as better than predicted cognitive ability or kind of functioning given level of neuropathological burden. And it can be operationalized, and that's how we do it in our studies. It can be operationalized as a residual, that is the disparity between cognitive functioning and neuropathology derived from a regression. This is a pretty common, this neurology article set forth a pretty common way that most people use how they conceptualize cognitive resilience, and that's how we'll be. And I have a couple of slides on this later. Okay, so back to your question. Why why do some people tolerate the presence of neuropathology in their brains as they grow older? Well, the biggest factor by far is education. So in one recent study of autopsied older adults, those with a college degree had an odds ratio of 2.01, or about 2 of being classified as resilient compared to those who didn't have a college degree. So compare that to smoking. Roughly, if you look at smoking, the effect of being a smoker on either a mortality risk or on developing lung cancer is about the same. It's about 2.0. Some studies a little bit higher, some a little bit, but it's roughly 2.0. So that's as a basis of comparison. Having a college degree, is pretty protective. Despite that, despite the fact that we know that education is a predictor, a lot of the variation in cognitive resilience remained unexplained. So there's still a lot of people who are even like not, for whom education does not explain this effect. So the search is on for, actually one other factor is cognitive activity. That's another factor that has emerged. It's not as big as education, but it's still another factor that predicts cognitive resilience. So the search is on for like other factors that might predict cognitive resilience. Well, enter personality traits. So given that beyond education, there's not a lot of well-established factors associated with cognitive resilience, we sought to test whether personality traits would be associated with cognitive resilience. So because I know that there's many disciplines represented here, I'll speak a little bit about personality traits. What are personality traits? Over 7 decades of research have shown that most personality traits, not all, there's personality is much more than just these big 5. There's personality is a broad area, but personality traits at least can be subsumed into these 5 kind of like broad meta traits. These are called the big 5, if you've heard of them. Actually, they're continua, so they can be thought of as like, on percentiles from the first percentile to the 99th percentile. So extroversion, introversion. Think of the most gregarious person that that person's probably up there 97th, 98th, 99th percentile. Think of like the shyest person that that person's probably below the 5th percentile on this dimension, more on the introverted end. Emotional stability, neuroticism. Think of the coolest, calmest, just like nothing disturbs them, like Rob Nussbaum, for example. Imperturbable. That would be like 98th, 99th percentile. When I used to teach personality at Purdue and then Fordham University before that, Neil Armstrong, the astronaut, was famous. He was like 99.999 percentile on emotional stability. Astronauts, by the way, are screened for this. You don't want somebody like me up there freaking out, like, the oxygen tank blew up, like we're all dead now. I'm the last person you'd want up there. You want somebody like oh, Houston, we have a problem. Just really cool kind of. You can see this on YouTube. Neil Armstrong was famously like high in emotional stability and also very low neuroticism. He was like practicing one day. There was like whatever thing he was in down in Florida. He was like, it spun out of control. He was like 6 seconds from death. He ejected, he parachuted out, whatever like practice lunar module he had, like went on the ground, exploded, and then he parachuted down. He's like, well, guess it's a paperwork day. And he literally just like, it would be me. I'd be like, oh my God, give me a shot of whiskey. I would just be like, I'd be so freaked out. And then you can see on YouTube when he was the lunar landing in 1969, as the module was going down, there was like this big boulder field, and like literally this historic moment could have ended quite tragically. This thing, the Eagle, the lunar module, could have like crashed, and like him and Buzz Aldrin would have been killed. And you can see this on YouTube. He just very cool, and he saw that they were about to land in this boulder field. And he calls out very calmly, like 75, 90, or 90. He's going on to telling Buzz Aldrin to make these adjustments, and he's doing so. They clear the boulder field, and Eagle has landed. They were literally like seconds from death, and he just totally remained calm. Think of like the person in your life who who is the most cool and calm, like just nothing really ever like excites them. That would be like somebody who's like 98th, 99th percentile on emotional stability. And then think of like somebody who's like just really just kind of like falls apart pretty quickly with regard to like whenever a stressor occurs. That would be like high neuroticism. That would be the other end of this dimension. Conscientiousness, impulsivity. People high in conscientiousness tend to be organized, punctual, persevering. The other end would be like less so, like maybe a little bit having some issues maybe with impulse control or self-control. Sometimes this dimension is called reliability. Is somebody reliable? This is what Rob was talking about earlier, agreeableness. Like think of somebody who's like warm and friendly and nice, and very kind. Such a person would be high on agreeableness, and then again, at the other end, think of like somebody who's like kind of not so warm, cold, maybe, a little bit like hostile and gruff. That would be the other end of this dimension. And then finally, openness or open-mindedness, being open to experiences versus being closed to experience. These are the big 5 traits. What relation do they have to dementia? Well, personality traits, specifically conscientiousness in the protective direction, and the neuroticism in the risk factor direction, predict dementia risk. There was a PNAS article by Ben Chapman at University of Rochester with a number of collaborators that came out a couple of years ago, showing just that these traits predict overall dementia risk. Personality traits predict many other health outcomes as well. Disease onset, it predicts longevity, et cetera. There's also plausible theoretical reasons why personality traits may play a role in cognitive resilience. One possible theoretical pathway is through inflammation. Personality theory notes and empirical evidence suggests that both higher neuroticism and lower conscientiousness, mainly those 2 traits, are characterized by higher exposure and reactivity to life stress. Some of the stuff that I was just mentioning about kind of like being able to like deal with stress. These in turn act through changes in hormonal outflow that from the sympathetic nervous system and HPA axis that can initiate and maintain inflammatory activity. So that's one possible pathway by which these traits may influence later outcomes like dementia, or other health outcomes. And there is some evidence. Gina Sutton down at Florida State, Ben Chapman at Rochester, and then Nick Turiano and I, when we were still at Purdue, we actually published a study as well showing that there are direct effects of personality traits on inflammatory markers. There are other pathways as well. The other major pathway or theoretical pathway is through cardiometabolic routes. So cardiometabolic risk is a second category of mechanisms or mediators that might connect personality to cognitive resilience. Personality traits, especially low conscientiousness and higher neuroticism, are predictors of these cardiometabolic risk factors. And that's probably one of the better studies that show this, but there's other studies as well. So those are the kind of theoretical reasons as to why personality traits might be connected to just overall dementia risk, but also cognitive resilience. In the data that I'm about to show you, we asked a number of research questions. We thought that high neuroticism would be associated with lower cognitive resilience, so it'd be vulnerability. And we also hypothesized that high conscientiousness would be associated with higher cognitive resilience, that is, promoting of cognitive resilience. And then we had some exploratory hypotheses that perhaps openness, extroversion, and agreeableness might also be protective. What we used were a number of studies based at Rush here in Chicago, the Ross and the MAP. The Ross is the religious orders study. It's been going on since 1994. It's like 1,500 or 2,000 people. In this particular sample, I realized when I went through my slides earlier, I did put the ends there. So in this study, we were restricted to those who had autopsies. So what's cool about this is that we'll be able to do follow-ups. So like 5 or 10 years from now, we'll be able to do a follow-up to see if our findings continue to hold, if they could like kind of within study replication when there are more autopsies. But for this study, we had 783 people who had autopsies in the Ross, and then we had 857 in the MAP. So I wrote those down because I realized I didn't put them on the slide. So the religious order study is an interesting study. It's Catholic nuns and priests and brothers from religious orders, more than 40 religious orders across the U.S., mainly in the Midwest, though. And then there's the Memory and Aging Project, which has been going on since 1997. Both are run by the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And the MAP are just community dwelling Chicago area people, and that's a much larger study. That's about 2,500 or 3,000 people. But again, like we had about 857 of those who had autopsies at the time of this study. The design for both were longitudinal, so they're followed up every single year. And the inclusion criteria is when they were enrolled, they had to have no dementia, and they had to agree to annual clinical advice. So this is really cool about these Rush studies, is that every year they get cognitive assessment. I mean, sometimes there's a given year where a given person can't make it this year. So there's some missing data, but it's pretty minimal. For most people, there's annual evaluation and cognitive testing, and then in both of these studies. All the participants agreed at the outset to brain and tissue donation after death. And you can learn more about the Rush studies at that website right there. Personality was measured with the NEO Big Five inventory. Global cognitive function was, it was an average of 19 neuropsych tests that were Z-scored. And then this is important because there's kind of two sets of findings I'll present. You could actually take this global cognitive function and use it in the conceptual or the operationalization of cognitive resilience two ways. One, like what was your cognitive functioning at the final assessment before death? Usually it's the last year before death. These are annual assessments, but not always. Sometimes the final assessment was maybe 2 or 3 years before, because sometimes people get sick and they can't make the last couple of assessments. So in many cases it's the last year, but in any case it's the final assessment prior to death. That's one way. The other is, there's annual assessments. So on some of these people we have 20 or more assessments. So you can look at longitudinal change, longitudinal cognitive, and making use of all of the cognitive assessments across the many years. So those are two ways that we can use these cognitive functioning measures, and we use both of them to put together two different measures of cognitive resilience. I'll talk about that in a second. Importantly, the neuropathologic indicators were assessed by autopsy. There's beta amyloid, tau tangles, vascular disease, Lewy bodies, TDP-43. So a whole number of these neuropathologic, and that's an actual brain from the study. The covariates were early life, SES, certain demographics, age at death, sex, race, education, chronic conditions, cognitive, because we know cognitive activity is related. We had cognitive activity as well. And then we had APOE, whether you had the variant 4 of the APOE gene. So we know that variant 4, about 13% of people have variant 4 of the APOE gene, and that places you at much higher risk for dementia, for just prevalence of dementia. So we control for that as well, whether you had variant 4 or not. Oh, we also controlled for time between final cognitive assessment and death, because as I mentioned earlier, for some people it's like, oh yeah, they made that last year, they came last year, and then something happened and they died. For other people there was a longer kind of stretch, they may have missed the last 2 or 3 years of annual assessments because they had a long extended illness and they really couldn't come in. So to control for differences in those individuals, an extended period of illness prior to death, as opposed to dying relatively quickly, we control for that, and that was quantified by time between final cognitive assessment and death, or for just annual assessment. Okay, so the two ways of assessing or of indexing or measuring cognitive resilience. So the first one, is where cognitive resilience is defined by the last visit before death. So for these analyses, we regressed global cognition, so those cognition functioning variables I mentioned earlier, on the neuropathologic indicators. And then from that, we retained a residual for every single person, and that was the key outcome that's the key outcome variable for cognitive resilience. Positive residuals indicate greater resilience. Your cognition was better. than the neuropathologic indicators would suggest. Negative residuals are obviously the reverse of that. We then took these residuals and we regressed them in turn on personality traits plus the covariates. Our estimation was we did both maximum likelihood and FIML. I'm going to present just the FIML results because they were pretty much the two methods were pretty much the same. The second way, this is when cognitive resilience is defined by the many annual assessments. So for analyses using this longitudinal cognitive decline, so the first step was to do linear growth models. Growth curve models or trajectory. It's kind of funny. Growth curve models were. So Robin said I mentioned I teach I'm teaching that in the winter quarter, by the way, multi-level modeling or mixed effects models. Of which growth curve models are one type. There's other types of mixed models, but it was because it was, as many of you know, being here at IPR, those models were developed in education and school settings. So they're called growth models because kids mostly grow. When they change in one direction. It's up. They grow in size, they grow in cognitive functioning, they grow in all kinds of, well, you can use these nice models, these change models, at the other end of the lifespan, but there's not much growth that's happening. So they're really great actually. These trajectory models for index or for estimating cognitive decline. They're used very extensively in the cognitive aging literature and the dementia literature to get cognitive. So we use these same kind of growth models. It's kind of funny that you're not growing on your cognitive function, but in any case, what we do is we employ these change models, whatever you want to call them, trajectory model. I prefer trajectory models. If you want to call them growth models, that's fine too. We did those making use of all of the assessments. So estimating a trajectory of cognitive decline. We then took those slopes from those growth models, and we regressed them on the neuropathologic indicators. So instead of just last visit before death on the neuropathologic indicators, now it's like a slope that quantifies your change, making use of all of those assessments. In some cases, going back 2 decades, we would take those slopes and regress them on the neuropathologic indicators. Here, the residual can be thought of as the deviation of the slope from the predicted slope. Okay. We then, as in the other analysis, we regress these cognitive decline residuals on personality traits, both individually and with the covariates. For both sets of models, last visit before death and longitudinal decline, we also looked at moderation by education and cognitive activity, the two things that we do know already predict cognitive resilience. I can tell you, there were no interactions. So we can just move on to that. Okay, so here's the first set of results. This is personality and cognitive resilience, or personality predicting cognitive resilience when cognitive resilience is defined by last visit before death. And you can see neuroticism is a significant predictor all the way through. Oh, so there's 3 different models. One is just unadjusted. And then in the second model, we put in age at death, sex, race, education, and early FSAS. And then in model 3, we add variant 4 of the APOE gene, chronic conditions, and cognitive activities. So we have these different sets of covariates that we enter at these different stages. And you can see neuroticism predicts in the negative direction. That is, it's a risk factor all the way through. Openness, interestingly, only starts out as a protective factor, but then once you put in some of these covariates, it goes away. Conscientiousness is not a factor. So this is oh yes.
Sorry, thank you, Dan. Do you see any main effects of these personality traits on cognitive functioning and/or neuropathology?
Yes, you know what? I have the actual paper on me, but so I would need to refer to it. There were some direct effects of personality traits on cognitive functioning. Yeah, certainly openness for sure. Conscientiousness as well, I believe. But I'd have to look at the paper. It's in my bag. And then and then there was some on neuropathologic indicators as well. I believe it was neuroticism, and maybe 1 or 2 others. But again, that's in the paper, which I have it on me, but I can sort of study a copy, Claudia, as well. Yeah. Great question. So anyway, last visit before death looks like neuroticism is a predictor of that in the direction that we would expect. Now, longitudinal change. So here's where the residual is based on changing cognition. Now here, conscientiousness is significant all the way through. Neuroticism starts out, but then once some covariates are added, it is rendered non-significant. But conscientiousness is a protective factor throughout. So when cognitive resilience is defined by longitudinal change, by cognitive decline, like better cognitive decline than you'd expect given your level of neuropathological burden, conscientiousness is a predictor there. So a couple of personality traits, neuroticism and conscientiousness, in line with theory, seem to emerge as predictors of cognitive resilience. But again, it depends on how you define cognitive resilience, whether it's like with many longitudinal assessments or last visit before death. So here's just a summary of the findings. Neuroticism predicted when cognitive resilience was based on last visit before death, and then conscientiousness predicted when cognitive resilience was based on longitudinal cognitive decline. Here's the paper. And so there's 4 people from Rush and then 4 people from Northwestern. So it was a nice collaboration. It was published in Journal of Gerontology, just came out last year. Oh, I should say, Brian James is actually one of our very close collaborators. He's a dementia epidemiologist at Rush, and he has really educated us extensively on this concept of neuropathological burden, which he's been researching for many years. And then David Bennett is he's the founding director of the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. So I'm going to start moving towards a conclusion here, and then we can start doing some questions. The next step is, well, we'd like to replicate this. A major future goal for us is to evaluate the robustness of these findings and the replicability of these findings. So we want to do 2 things in the future. One is replicating these findings in other samples, and then testing mediational pathways. So based on those inflammatory and cardiometabolic pathways that I discussed earlier, we'd like to try to test and see, well, is that the reason why? Why is personality connected to cognitive resilience? Is it due to inflammatory markers or inflammatory pathways or cardiometabolic pathways? So essentially testing mediation. That's our second goal. In both of these, just kind of general replication as well as testing these mediation models, what we'd like to do is do coordinated analysis. Now, what's coordinated analysis? So I'm going to get a little methodological here for a second. Coordinated analysis is the simultaneous analysis of multiple data sets done in the service of enhancing robustness and replicability. It then uses the tools of meta-analysis to summarize findings. So if you can muster 10, 15, 20 studies from different sources, to answer a given research question, you can analyze them simultaneously, and then present them, of course, separately. But at the same time, use the tools of meta-analysis to summarize them. What you can do is you can kind of jump ahead and do almost like a meta-analysis in real time. It has a certain advantage over regular meta-analysis. And I know many of you here at IPR are aware of the limitation. Meta-analysis is one of the tools that's used to kind of make policy recommendations. There's been 50 studies, let's meta-analyze them and see what's the overall effect across these studies in order to be able to make policy recommendations. The thing about relying on about traditional meta-analysis, and I know many of you are aware of this, is when you rely on the published literature, the effect sizes, the meta-analytically summarized effect sizes tend to be too big, because of publication bias, the file drawer effect, the studies that were not significant, well, we're not going to publish that, so there's a lot of studies that they're just out there that just have not been published. And so as a result, and again, people are aware of this. In fact, former IPR director Larry Hedges actually tried to, about a decade ago, or a decade and a half, has tried to devise methods, to get around this kind of publication bias, to correct for this publication bias. One of the nice things about coordinated analysis is that from the outset, you're not relying on the published literature. From the outset, you're analyzing these data. So we've done a bunch of these. Here's an example. So about 4 years ago, Eileen and I published, there's like 29 authors on this paper because like everyone from all these studies had to be on. So we did a study of personality and mortality risk. And here's just one of the graphs from the, so again, these were all the studies that had conscientiousness and then also had mortality information. We had more than these number of studies in the paper, but these were the only studies that had conscientiousness. And you can see there's a protective effect of conscientiousness. Here's the meta-analytically, here's the weighted the weighted effect size, the meta-analytic summary of that effect size. As you can see, there's a few studies that probably, if these individuals, if the investigators of those studies, would have found this effect, they probably would have opted to not publish. Be like, oh, look, it's not significant. We're not going to publish that. So it would never have made it into the literature. But in a coordinated analysis, when you have these data sets all from the outset, they're all included. You can have non-significant effects. What that also does, it gives a more realistic estimate of the effect size, and so it kind of provides a bit of a hedge against, that kind of publication bias. Here's another example. We do a lot of trajectory modeling of different types of variables, well-being variables, cognitive trajectories, of course, personality trajectories. So neuroticism tends to go down over the lifespan, although there appears to be a bit of an uptick in many studies at the very end of life. So here's another example of using trajectory models in a coordinated analysis framework. The big thick black line there is the meta-analytic summary of all those growth curves weighted by n, because many of these studies have different n's. So what we'd like to do is do the same exact thing with cognitive resilience. Yeah, I'll take a question. I'll take that question before I go to the next slide. I'm almost done too.
I'm wondering if I'm really intrigued. I know this might be getting off course by this uptick at the end. Yeah. Is it that the same individuals develop neuroticism, or is it selective mortality?
That's a really great question. It very much could be selective mortality. Yeah, that it's basically like, well, the people who are, I mean, if all that stuff I said earlier about higher neuroticism, like activating, inflammatory pathways. Yeah, you would think, and we do know that neuroticism is high neuroticism is predictive of shorter longevity. That could definitely be the effect. Yeah. No, if the people with high neuroticism would have died, they'd be out of the data set, and so that uptick might be like a survivor effect essentially. Yeah. Great question. So, yeah, this got published last year. So that's great. You should collaborate with us on the next paper. So we'd like to take this idea of coordinated analysis and apply it to cognitive resilience. But the data requirements are high for cognitive resilience. So first of all, you have to be dead. So so we have to restrict. Well, the investigators don't have to be dead, so we have to restrict ourselves to participants who have died and who have autopsy data. So it's very few studies that do these brain autopsies. It's very few. But they also have to have cognitive functioning data while they're alive, personality data while they were alive, covariates while they're alive. And then for the mediation analyses, we needed to have indicators of inflammation and metabolic indicators. Yeah, so very high data requirements. So we identified 5. So the 2 that we've already used, Ross and MAP, the MARS, the Minority Aging Research, that's also run by the people at Rush. The Einstein Aging Study, which is based in the Bronx, Albert Einstein School of Medicine, and the WashU Alzheimer's Disease Research Center Memory and Aging Project. Those are the 5 studies that we've identified that have this kind of a high data requirement. So what we like to do in our future directions is replicate in the MARS, the Einstein Aging Study, and the WashU study, replicate these basic findings that I showed you today, then test in all 5 studies these inflammatory and cardiometabolic pathways as mediators of the link between personality and cognitive resilience. Additionally, we'd like to examine SES and racial disparities in the personality cognitive resilience association, as well as in the mediational pathways. We wrote a whole R01. Oh, by the way, not only is there a special call for for dementia, there's as many of you know, there's ADRD, there's a RFAs for ADRD. There's a notice of special interest on cognitive resilience itself. So underneath the general ADRD, Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, RFA, underneath that, there's like many of these NOCs, these notices of special interest, and one of them is on cognitive resilience. So we wrote an R01 to do this, thinking like, hey, there's ADRD, RFA, and then we actually can tick off the box for one of the NOCs, and of course we got not discussed like just last month. So we submitted this R01, but it wasn't funded. Here's our R01 team. A number of IPR associates, or faculty affiliates, I should say, are on this. So Ani Rogers, Edith Chen, Greg Miller, and of course, my colleague at MSS, Eileen Graham. We have some of our postdocs, Emery Beck, Jing Luo, and then soon to be a former postdoc, Emily Wilroth. She just got a tenure track job at WashU St. Louis. Yay for Emily. So she's on this grant as well, but she'll be moving off to St. Louis like next summer. And of course, we have on this grant some of our Rush collaborators, Brian James and David Bennett. So we're gonna keep at it. We're gonna see what the reviews say, but hopefully, but we do have an R01 that we're gonna try to get funded on this particular issue about these new directions that I just mentioned. There's another new direction. I'm almost done, I promise. So Emily Wilroth, who I just mentioned, the one who'll be going off to WashU St. Louis next summer, she just got a K99 earlier this year, and she is examining how subjective well-being is related to cognitive resilience. Her K99 is focused also on cognitive resilience, but her key predictor is well-being. In a paper that we just submitted, both eudaimonic and hedonic well-being. I don't think I have time to explain, but there's like these two different ways of conceptualizing well-being. Hedonic well-being, which is positive affect, negative affect, life satisfaction, then eudaimonic well-being, like things like purpose in life. These two kind of like major conceptualizations of well-being. Both eudaimonic and hedonic well-being were related to cognitive resilience in the Ross and the MAP studies. Net of SES, education, cognitive activity, neuroticism, and depression. So we control for all those. So well-being may be an additional fruitful pathway for understanding toleration of neuropathology. Some policy implications. So personality and well-being are potentially modifiable targets that may promote cognitive resilience in line with this prevention focus that I mentioned earlier. Well-being actually, and Claudia, I look at you because of your eminent well-being researcher, well-being actually may be a more suitable target. There are well-being interventions that have already been developed. So well-being actually may be the more suitable target. Yet there are some that have argued that personality traits are appropriate targets of policy-oriented interventions as well. I direct you to a paper by Vipka Blydorn and a number of other co-authors that came out a couple of years ago, the policy relevance of personality traits that came out in American Psychologist. So personality traits might be potentially the target of modifying interventions. I think personally, though, the way to maybe a better way of kind of using personality with regard to an intervention focus is to use a targeting or tailoring approach. That is where basically interventions are tailored based on one's personality. So as we know, interventions typically are not one size fits all. When an intervention, once we know an intervention works, it probably doesn't work in the same way for all people or for all children in the case of child interventions. Those interventions that to prevent dementia or to promote tolerance of neuropathology may benefit from tailoring that's based on personality. And this personality informed tailoring of interventions may have the effect of making such interventions more powerful. So that might be a better way of actually using personality in a policy-oriented way. I'd like to thank our many collaborators on this work, both the collaborators we've worked with already, plus the collaborators on this R01 that we hope to get funded at some point in the future, and acknowledge some funding. And oh, by the way, yes, there's a couple of grants that fund this. The first one is we're going to run out next year. We were not able to get it renewed, unfortunately. This one's an interesting one. It actually has an IPR affiliate, Joe Ferry from the economics department. the Boston Early University Mortality Study, which dementia is one of our key outcomes. That's an interesting study that perhaps when we maybe a future IPR talk, Joe Ferry and I can maybe co-present. That's a really interesting grant that we're doing. And then, of course, I must acknowledge the recently funded Pepper Center that Northwestern just got. Northwestern is the first new Pepper Center. There's only like 14 Pepper Centers like in the whole country. And Northwestern is the first new one in quite a few years. And Mike Wolf is the director of it. And thank you for your attention.